my apologies for actually skipping my previous session, and this entire, I think the change in the schedule was largely attributable to me. So I'm feeling slightly under the weather, so pardon me if my energy levels are not up to the mark, but I'll do my best. So before I get into the meat of the topic, let me explain what was my motivation behind choosing this particular topic, so that I set some kind of a dialectical basis for this particular concept itself. So I think with Mr. Surendranath present here and a couple of other people present here, I can afford to make this statement. Over the last 1.5 to 2 years, there's been an active movement with respect to the amendment needed in Articles 26 to 30, and that is effectively has been presented as the Hindu Charter. And this particular movement, I think, has its own validity, has its own standing, and has its own significance. So that got me thinking about what exactly is the actual position in the Constitution before it was interfered with by judicial interventions in subsequent decades. That's precisely why I started going in this particular direction. So there are two ways of actually winning a debate in law, according to me. One is either you arrive at a position where you have the ability to reframe the rules of the game through amendments. That's one way of going about it. The other way is to reinterpret existing provisions, because at the end of the day, legal provisions are amenable to varied interpretations depending on the kind of support through facts, history, and logic you're able to give to a particular interpretation. So there is a decent chance that the same provision is capable of varied interpretations at the hands of different people depending on what drives them and what is it that they're able to marshal in terms of facts and logic to support that particular position. So when I started doing this, I basically asked myself, am I supposed to wait for that one fine day when somebody decides to amend Articles 26 to 30 after realizing the civilizational need for this particular amendment? Or is there something that you can do before this amendment is undertaken in the first place? So to most people, this could seem like intellectual dishonesty, because you're trying to give a different interpretation to a certain set of provisions, which may or may not sit well with the history of that particular provision. And I asked myself, where is the entire perception coming from? And in law, there is something called as hindsight perception. So what you do is the experience of the decades following the 26th of January 1950 has been superimposed on the document which was created on or which came into force on the 26th of January 1950. So the existence of a clear, avowedly Nehruvian socialist worldview which has presided over the formative years of this country has led us to believe that the very document that created this political unit, not the civilization unit, this political unit called India, itself is Nehruvian and socialist in character. And the more you read the debates, the more you read about the history, the more you read about the circumstances under which this particular document was crafted, it completely demolishes this presumption, it completely demolishes this myth. Nehruvian socialism or Nehruvian vision of secularism has very little to do with the constitution in the first place. It has very little to do with the antecedents of this particular document. It has very little to do with the building blocks and the foundational ingredients of this book called the Constitution. So as part of my own vision statement or the assignment or the task that I have cut out for myself, and over which or with respect to which I've already started working, from a more rigorous standpoint, from a more scholarly standpoint as opposed to mere talking point for the purposes of rhetoric, is to treat the document primarily as a civilizational document and generate as much argument and generate as much support for that particular position as possible, so that you're in a position to reinforce the position of dharma as a policy-making construct in the life and polity of India. Fortunately for me, turns out that history is not pitted against my position. It is in fact consistent with my position. It is in fact helpful to my position. And that's precisely why I started looking at this particular issue, because at the end of the day, Article 370's debate is now going to force us to ask the identity of each of the princely states that acceded to the Indian Union, and thereby ask, if the individual units had a specific character, how is it that that particular character has been deprived of the larger whole, or let's say of the whole which is effectively, let's say, a conglomeration of those units. If 565 states were the number of princely states, out of them, a significant number of them had a specific religious character, and the partition has a religious basis, and subsequently two different unions are formed, is it the position of people who want to read history that these Hindu princely states came together to form a country which is avowedly anti-Hindu through a document which is meant to be anti-Hindu? That particular logic certainly didn't sit well with me. So what I would suggest is, please try and read the accession document of Kashmir with India, because that is effectively the template that was followed for the rest of the states as well. And that particular document of accession, effectively, or the instrument of accession, comes from one particular template which Mr. V.P. Menon, the right-hand man of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel during the course of integration, proposed in his document called the Integration of States. In that white paper, he has actually proposed that particular document. What is being used in Kashmir is actually in favor of the Hindu character of India. And let me explain why and how. The instrument of accession contains certain paragraphs which reserves for the princely states the right to comment on certain subject matter outside of defense, communication, and external affairs. The reason why this was actually done was because the princely states, a good number of them, when they were negotiating with the cabinet mission as part of Chamber of Princes or Chamber of States, wanted to also preserve, apart from their own privileges, the identity and character with respect to religious identity and character of their states, because a good number of these princely states or those ruling families were the ones who were treated as defenders of the faith for the purposes of their own states. So Travancore family is a prominent example in that particular sense. It was treated as defender of dharma, and that's precisely why the umbilical cord between the Padmanabha Swami temple and that particular family can never be severed. No matter what happens in the constitution, no matter what kind of amendment is undertaken, notwithstanding the abolition of the privy purses, their position with respect to that particular temple can never be changed, because they were primarily treated as defenders of dharma. So the more you read the history of the states in Rajputana, or you read the relationship between the Chamundeshwari temple and the princely state of Mysore, and how they went about dedicating their kingdoms or creating policies which are conducive to the furtherance of dharma, it is inconceivable that the final document which came into force, or which was presented on the 29th of November 1949 and came into force on the 26th of January 1950, is anti-dharmic in nature. That is something that you just cannot come to a conclusion to at all. So there are some brilliant documents that my research team has actually managed to pull out, which I'm in the process of actually going through and presenting it before the larger audience. And hopefully I'll convert that into a book in the due course of time. I'm trying to find a co-author who has a strong hold of history for this, which effectively captures the fact, or which captures the following three facts. One, the myth that the citizens of this land need to be educated in the values of Magna Carta can be busted, for the simple reason that we don't need to be taught the concept of confederacy, we don't need to be taught the concept of constitution, we don't need to be taught the concept of free speech, we don't need to be taught the concept of a republican state which has existed for at least a good 2000 years in this country in various places. So when you think of, let's say, even the Mahabharata, or you think of any of these Itihasas and Puranas, when you speak of the Yadavas, you do not speak of them as having a king, you actually speak of them as a confederacy. The Vrishnis were effectively a confederacy. So in their negotiations with third parties or in their own internal decision-making processes, they were democratic in nature. And this seems to have been captured by modern authors as part of their scholarly works written in the 1920s and 30s. So the only thing that perhaps sometimes we may have a problem with in terms of a mental barrier is because that particular document is written in English, we may assume that therefore the person who's writing it is also anglicized in his mindset. Perhaps that may not be true, because if all of us can speak in English and our first language is English in most communications, and we still think of ourselves as Bharatiyas and Indics, I think we should give the same credit to people who existed at least 100 years ago, okay? Because I'm sure they're slightly more rooted in Indic than us, okay? So as far as I'm concerned, one theory that needs to be presented and pushed in a very strong way, because the constitution has effectively become the battleground for the future. Having lost political assertion and having lost avenues in every other place, I think the constitution is now going to be the sole battleground in a lot of places. Therefore, as I've written recently, the nature of this document needs to be understood. So, how do you build this argument and how do you build this logic? One, if that particular document has always been treated as a socio-politico-legal document, legal is at the far, or let's say it's at the fag end of this particular calculus, which means the bare text of the constitution effectively occupies a position which is informed by the social circumstances as well as the political circumstances which led to the crafting of this particular document. Therefore, there is no provision of the constitution which can be divorced from the history of the making of the constitution. So, one more example. I keep getting this beautifully informed and thoroughly lettered statement as far as the law is concerned that no, the Indian constitution should be a 15-page booklet like the US constitution. I'm sorry, I think that is perhaps the most uninformed statement that anybody can make, because the circumstances in which this particular country was created was vastly different from the circumstances in which the United States was created. Here you have gone about talking to various princely states to come together to form a political unit called Bharat, and as a consequence of which the document was supposed to capture the terms of negotiations between the princely states and the Indian Union, which is why when you look at the chapter of the constitution that deals with the relationship between the union as well as the states, a significant portion of that particular chapter is informed by the terms of those negotiations, so that princely states do not lose their say with respect to the one central issue, their identity. So while it is assumed that only indigenous communities in the Northeast negotiated for specific rights to protect their indigenous nature, the fact is that was one central aspect of negotiation between all princely states and the Indian Union. Therefore, as much as Assam or Tripura or Meghalaya or Mizoram has the right to preserve its indigenous character as part of the CAA debate or the NRC debate or the NPR debate, my point is every state in this country has the right to preserve its indigenous character, which was specifically captured as part of its founding charter in its negotiation with the Indian Union. So this particular exercise is not an exercise. I typically don't have the time for academic scholarly pursuits, so I try and keep it as practical as possible. There's a decent chance that I'm not even cut out for academic scholarly pursuits, and maybe I don't have the IQ for it. But the reason that I've chosen this particular subject is it has absolute relevance in the interpretation of the Constitution. If somebody contends that Article 370 as a provision must never be read in isolation and must necessarily be read in the context of its creation and the terms of the negotiation between multiple parties, and therefore history becomes relevant for Article 370, that becomes equally relevant for Articles 14, 15, 17, 25, 26. And it also becomes relevant for the use of the word secularism. So WhatsApp University informs us, and I'm sure we are all benefited by its munificence and its knowledge, that secularism was a word that is never to be found in the Constitution before the 42nd Amendment of 1976. Wrong, incorrect, factually incorrect, no basis, don't rely on WhatsApp. The word secular was always present, and I dare say always present, in Article 25(2)(a). Because there is a reference to secular activity associated with a religious practice under Article 25(2)(a), which effectively forms the basis for HRC legislations, which allows the government to come with legislations that control secular activities of religious practices but not religious practices. Therefore, when somebody makes the statement that the word secularism was never present in the Constitution before 1976, immediately shun that person from your life. He is not worth entertaining any further. He is not to be spoken to any further, at least on the concept of Constitution. These are the kind of pernicious myths that effectively pit us against the document itself. So when I'm trying to push for this particular interpretation of the Constitution, my opponents are not from the left. My opponents are from this side of the ideological fence. Because it is this particular so-called echo chamber that I'm having to try and convince that the more you pit yourself against this document, you're actually walking into the other side's trap, and you have accepted the premise of the other side that this is a Nehruvian socialist document, which it is not. That gentleman had a lot of time for Edwina, but not for the constitution. Okay? So his role in the crafting of this constitution is overrated when you give him the benefit of the doubt. Please go through the drafting committee. Please see who was party to this particular document and who took part in the discussions in this particular document. Mr. Nehru, Sri Pandit Nehru, had very little to do with this particular document's crafting and drafting. So the reason why I'm having to say this is, the moment you do that, two options present yourself immediately. One, is it possible to invite a reinterpretation of existing provisions through existing litigations before the court, as opposed to trying to push for an amendment, which perhaps seems like the long shot until there is crystallization of political will in that particular direction? And political will crystallize only when there is a political incentive. And thus far, I say this as a matter of fact, if you were to do a SWOT analysis, I think we have been an utter failure in capturing the political incentive of doing this for the existing dispensation. And I don't see that happening in the next 1 or 2 years at the very least, unless and until there is a mass movement that pushes itself towards this particular direction. Pending such an eventuality, you have to ask yourself, am I going to say, since they are not doing it, that justifies my inaction and therefore I have nothing else to do at this stage which I can work on? My answer is no, that's not the answer. Any number of cases which are pending before the court today are giving you an opportunity to raise all central issues with respect to this land's identity, especially the CA debate and the 370 debate. These are not catastrophes, these are fantastic opportunities to reinforce the notion that this is effectively a Bharatiya nation. And therefore, when you actually read the Constitution, I would say don't read the Constitution. Keep it aside for a moment. You simply focus on reading the circumstances in which the document was created, because ultimately that circumstance has informed every aspect of the Constitution. It is not my case that the Constitution is perfect, but it is certainly my case that it is not as bad as we make it out to be, and there is an ally to be found in the Constitution provided we are alive to it and provided we open our eyes to it. And this is not something that a lawyer can do alone, and the lawyer should be the last person to do it, according to me. Because at the end of the day, if you take, how many entrepreneurs do we have here? Startup founders or entrepreneurs in general. Do you go to a lawyer asking for an opinion first, or you decide what is the business objective that is to be achieved, and then you go to the lawyer asking him, how do I get it done? Right? That's what you do. Therefore, the lawyer or his gyan that he's always willing to share, no, this is what the provision says, that is what the provision says, is the last person to be spoken to, according to me. And I'm making this as a self-defeating observation which goes against my own fraternity. Okay? Therefore, the first thing that you have to ask yourself is, what is the goal that you're pushing towards? And the goal is towards the interpretation of this central document as a dharmic document. Second, is this chicanery at play, or is this backed by sufficient logic and evidence? There you fall back on the historian. There you fall back on the historian for his knowledge of what exactly transpired during that particular period, not just from December 1946 until January 1950, but even before that. What was the nature of the electorate? Because I've been told by geniuses sitting in New Jersey and other places, which I'm sure effectively makes them better qualified than me, is that no, this particular document is a document prepared by the unelected. So effectively, how was the Constituent Assembly created in the first place? Who populated that? Was there an election held before that? Is something nobody wants to ask and answer. What was the composition of the Constituent Assembly? How many people were present? And did we intend to give special treatment to minorities as part of this particular discussion the moment the concept of Pakistan came into existence and couldn't have been done away with? So anyone who wants to read on some of these issues, there is a wonderful 4-volume book called The Framing of the Constitution. It's available online. It's freely available. The second volume of this particular book, which we are in the process of reading extensively to generate arguments for a lot of pending matters, is the book that is the volume that deals with fundamental rights in extenso. It deals with the formation of the committees and the subcommittees and the advisory committees for fundamental rights as well as for minority rights. And you understand from a reading of these documents that the concept of minority in this particular case was, since complete population transfer couldn't have been effected for multiple reasons, we have to ensure that these people are not shortchanged. So for all practical purposes, this was a benevolent, generous decision taken by the majority to protect the minority as opposed to giving it as an entitlement. That is your answer to the argument of minorityism. That is your answer to the argument of minority appeasement. That is your answer to the argument of secularism. That is your answer to the argument of whether India is Dharma Nirpeksha or Sarvadharma Sambhav. What does it exactly mean? And does it necessarily mean that India has to abandon its own identity to accommodate multiple identities, or can it do justice to both without giving up its latent character? So this is not a pursuit in history. This is not a pursuit in identifying, oh, we understood the making of Pushpak Vimana 2000 years ago and all that. I'm not qualified to make any of those statements. The pursuit of this particular line of inquiry is to understand the informational sources and the influencing characters of the Constitution. So, as part of the Padmanabha Swamy case, where I had the benefit of such a fantastic research team, I was astounded at the kind of negotiations that took place, where VP Menon informs Sardar Patel that these people are less bothered about the kind of properties that they're supposed to own after the merger of the princely state with the union, and they're more bothered about who controls the temple, who protects the temple, who will take care of the traditions of the temple. That is the fight, and that is the issue that this family has fought for decades, and that effectively translated to, if you read the covenant of merger between the Travancore Cochin princely state and the Indian Union, Article 8 of the covenant is effectively the subject of the discussion before the Supreme Court in the Padmanabha Swamy case, where we are trying to say that the Travancore Devaswam board, which has been formed, or which was formed, was effectively as a consequence of the negotiation between the princely states and the union. And it was to ensure that the ruling family or the descendants of this family continued to hold on to their position as defenders of the faith. So it has been such a revelation, and had it not been for my involvement in that particular matter, there is a decent chance that I'd be mouthing the same nonsense. No, this constitution is effectively a baby of the Anglophilic civilized people who are trying to civilize the heathen pagan natives. No, it is not. It certainly is not. The mere fact that it is written in English does not mean that it is phobic to the native spirit. It is not. So, my invitation to the better informed people in this audience is that perhaps you could invest your energies in trying to create multiple arguments through different verticals in cementing the logic and in cementing the position that the Constitution is a dharmic document and there is no running away from it. The moment you take that particular position, it automatically clarifies your priorities, and it also says what can be the foundational principles in the framing of policies at multiple levels. Then it answers also the question of whether you can further the concept of tourism with respect to pilgrim centers, something which Ashish sir, I'm sure, must have touched upon already. Is this the manner in which these issues are supposed to be approached? So, therefore, the three states that I'm hoping to actually read about more for the sake of diversity is at least that state that we were talking about where it venerates Eklingji. I think that's Mewar. So Mewar, Travancore, and perhaps one more state, preferably Odisha, at least to try and cover as many areas as possible so that we have a clear cross-sectional view of how this entire issue looks like. So I'm not here to present conclusions, I'm here to present vision statement, and I'm trying to explain what is the methodology that I'm trying to approach or adopt to try and further this particular narrative, so to speak. And I'm being so confident about presenting this in public, even before I have conclusions, is because when I've read the Constant Assembly debates, I'm unable to run away from the conclusion that I think I'm on the right path. So, bottom line, please recalibrate your lens and compass with respect to how you see this document. If you think of it as an enemy, I think you're actually creating an even more powerful enemy, and I think you already have enough of them. Okay? So see a friend or an ally in the Constitution. If not 100% a friend, it is still presenting you with decent options and building blocks on the basis of which you can build your dharmic edifice. Thank you.
We'll now have a question and answer session with Sai Deepak. Anyone has a question?
Yes, the gentleman at the end. And then there's a person here. So, is there a person who's actually helping them with a mic? I think, okay. I was hoping a question would come from Surendranath ji. Okay, it has come. Yes. Right. Correct. Okay, so we are trying to make the best of what we have, very limited options that we have at this stage. So I would be very wary of saying that no, 2019 effectively has proclaimed the dawning of the civilizational identity of the dispensation in power. No, that's not happened. There's a long way to go. Okay, next. Yes, ma'am. Fantastic. Right, right. Right. So, so the question is, how does one determine the character of a princely state or its religious character? Is it on the basis of the identity of the ruler, or is it on the basis of the identity of the population, or something else? So, if you look, and this is something that we have had an internal discussion specifically on this point as to how do you put them in different baskets. It is directly on the basis of the identity of the ruler. That's how it has largely been employed. Okay, that protects your position even with respect to Kashmir to a significant extent. The only argument would be then what would you do with respect to Hyderabad and Junagadh? That would be a different argument. I'll reserve that argument for later. Okay. Now, we have actually gone beyond merely the identity of the ruler. The identity of the ruler perhaps was an argument that was necessary for the Government of India Act of 1935, which effectively was the legal basis for determining the religious character of princely states. I am going to say that you go on the character of princely states, but do not limit yourself to the definition of the Government of India Act of 1935, because I am not going to be held back by a definition given by a British legislation. I am going to ask myself, what is the overall character of the princely state? Therefore, the indicia that I would use is the identity of the ruler is just one aspect of it. The composition, two, the manner of administration, the rules of administration. So, for instance, if certain princely states clearly had the concept of an Ashtapradhan or whatnot, and it followed certain dharmic principles, then avowedly that is the case. But the argument is going a step further, and I'll explain why. I am going to make the clear argument that the civilizational identity of this land, and this is a question that was asked of me in leftist dens. I don't want to name the institutions, but in those institutions I've been asked this question. What do you mean by civilizational identity? Who forms part of this identity? Very simple. If the object of their loyalty is within the weave of this civilization, then they belong to this civilization. If their loyalty is determined by factors external to this particular civilization and its geography, that's the end of the matter. And that is a factual question. Okay? Perhaps the concept of gender is mental, but the concept of sex is biological. Therefore, I am going on the basis that these specific facts will inform the question. And that is why the civilization argument is going to be those narratives and those worldviews which effectively subscribe to the concept of dharma are part of the civilizational weave of this particular land, regardless of the demographic composition. The alteration in the demographic composition is a history-induced aberration which needs to be corrected. That's a different issue altogether. But that does not take away from the dharmic character of these places. That's the foundational argument. So absolute grundnorm or the foundation for this entire thing, this Astivaram is going to be, this is a dharmic civilization. And therefore, worldviews which are antithetical to dharma can perhaps live here and can continue to survive here, but their right to actually profess, propagate, and expand will be subject to its consequences and implications for dharma. That will be the position if I were to draft an anti-conversion bill. That will be the position that I take. Because then I am also taking into account anti-Vedic or Avedic positions of dharma as well, and still treat them as part of the dharmic weave, but keep the doors open for other worldviews which effectively may not just disagree with it, but consciously believe that this dharmic standpoint must be eviscerated completely. That is a position that has no accommodation in this narrative at all. There will be no quarter yielded on that particular ground. Next.
Hello?
Yes.
Sai?
Yes.
So we'll actually conclude
Done?
this.
Okay, thanks.
So no more questions, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we'll now break for lunch.